Montana, summer of 1883. The wind tore across the barren hill as if it meant to steal the very breath from the earth. Red dust rose and tangled with the blinding white sun, clinging to the faded roof of the small house where Zaria Bennett lived alone. For 3 years, since the coal mine explosion that buried her young husband, no one had set foot on that hill. Mornings began with the hoarse cry of a rooster and the wind whispering through the cracks of the door. Zarya stoked the fire, her hands roughened from chopping wood and hauling water from the far well. The smell of ash and cornmeal mingled with the chill of dawn. Everything moved quietly, methodically, rituals that kept her from thinking too much. Behind the house, a small garden clung to life. Vegetables barely grew in the dry soil, but along the fence, wildflowers her husband once planted still pushed through the dust, the only green that refused to die. Each evening, she watered them, not for the flowers themselves, but for the memory of his hands digging those holes, his voice saying softly, "This will be your reading spot when I'm done working." But he never came back, and she had never sat there. Every week, she still waited for the mail rider from town. The teaching job she'd applied for the year before had never been answered. The small town didn't need another colored woman teaching its children. Maybe her letter never reached. Maybe it had, only to be tossed into the fire. She no longer knew. That day, the air was strange, hot and heavy. Gray clouds gathered in the distance, but the wind blew dry and sharp. She was hanging laundry when she saw a figure on horseback making his way up the slope. The sun blurred his outline, but she caught flashes of a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Zarya froze, her heartbeat quickening. Visitors were rare here. Her cousin Ruby, the only kin she had left, usually stopped by once a month with flour, sugar, and gossip from town. But this rider wasn't Ruby. The man's back was straight, his shoulders broad, his movements slow and certain, like someone who belonged to the open road. She set the basket down and gripped her apron tight. Instinctively, she backed toward the porch and reached for the small axe leaning by the door, the habit of a woman who lived too long with silence as her only guard. When the stranger drew closer, his features came into view: light stubble along a strong jaw, sunburned skin, hair the color of dark wheat tied low at the nape. His leather coat bore patches. His boots were stained with the same red dust that covered the plains. He stopped at the foot of her steps, tipped his hat slightly, and looked up at her with eyes the color of storm clouds. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice rough-edged but calm. "You must be Mrs. Bennett." She frowned, keeping her distance. "Who's asking?" The man's lips twitched into a half-smile that seemed equal parts truth and trouble. "Name's August Wilder. I was sent to lend a hand." The wind picked up again, swirling dust between them. Zarya blinked, confused. "A hand?" He rested one arm over his saddle horn, studying her with a steady gaze. "You're Mrs. Bennett, widow on the southern hill. Miss Ruby said you could use someone to chop wood, fix that roof, and maybe talk a bit, so you don't forget the sound of people." For a heartbeat, the blood in her body turned to ice. She turned away, her tone sharp. "I don't need anyone. She had no right." "Maybe not," he interrupted gently, "but she's not wrong." He dismounted. His movements were unhurried, unthreatening, yet they made her step back all the same. He pulled off his gloves, removed his hat, and wiped his brow with his sleeve. The sunlight caught the sinew of his forearm, the pale scar tracing his cheekbone. A face carved by wind and time until nothing false remained. You might not need me, he said quietly, but I need the work. And from the look of things, this place could use a bit of patching. He glanced up toward the roof, where a broken plank hung loose in the wind. Zarya's grip tightened on the axe handle. Ruby had no right to hire anyone without asking me first. The afternoon wind carried the scent of distant rain. On the porch, August Wilder leaned against a wooden post, one hand pulling off his gloves, the other brushing the dust from his worn leather coat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the calm ease of a man used to long roads, unhurried, unbothered, owing nothing to anyone. Zarya stood framed in the doorway, uncertain what to do. The light behind him poured in, setting her brown skin aglow against the dimness inside. Her dark eyes, deep and watchful, gave nothing away but caution. Miss Ruby said I was to keep you company, August said at last, his voice a low drawl with the roughness of the South. And maybe split some wood, fix that leaky roof, if you'll have it. Zarya frowned. Each word landed heavy in the air, like the first drops of a storm that wouldn't let up. She hired you for what exactly? He shrugged, lips curling slightly. To keep you from getting lonely, I reckon. Her cheeks flushed. Keep me from... Who do you think I am? Don't know, he said simply. But I'd wager you're not one for laughter. And if you don't mind me saying, he paused, eyes glinting with faint mischief. A woman who forgets how to smile is a worrying sight. Zarya turned sharply. I don't need anyone to make me laugh, and I didn't hire you. That's fine, August said, unbothered, his tone light as dust. I don't sell smiles. I sell labor. His gaze drifted upward, finger pointing to where the roof had begun to lift in the wind. And that looks like something worth fixing. She held her breath. There was no pleading in his voice, no apology. Only the plain confidence of a man who'd seen too much to pretend. Get off my land, Mr. Wilder, she said, soft but certain. He regarded her for a long moment, then tipped his head. If that's what you want, I'll go. He put his gloves back on, stepped off the porch. His horse pawed the ground, stirring a circle of red dust. Zarya watched him, her anger tangled with something else, something she couldn't name. Maybe regret. It had been too long since anyone had spoken to her at all, even if only to rile her. Thunder rolled in the distance. The sky turned the color of wet lead. The wind shifted, sharp and alive, rattling the dry boards. Just as August reached the gate, a sudden gust slammed the house door wide open. The crash echoed across the hill. A piece of wood split, making Zarya cry out softly. She rushed forward, struggling to pull the door shut against the force of the storm. In an instant, August was back. He climbed the steps in 2 strides, seized the edge of the door, and pushed it into place. They stood face to face, separated by a single heartbeat. The wind screamed through the rafters, rain spattered their cheeks, and the smell of wet earth mixed with horsehide and the faint ash on her dress. "Hold steady," he said over the roar, voice rough but sure. She pressed her hand against the frame, her fingers brushing the back of his. His skin was hot, dry, and scarred. The warmth from it ran up her arm like a spark. Together they fought the wind until the latch caught, then stood breathing hard in the sudden quiet. Rain began to tap across the roof, steady and relentless. August leaned a hand against the wall, looking down at her. She turned away, her voice small. "Thank you." "No need," he replied, softer now. "I don't like leaving a place in the wind. brings bad luck. Zarya said nothing. Her pulse still raced. The anger she'd felt toward Ruby had faded into something unfamiliar, part shame, part curiosity. She glanced at him again. The broad shoulders, the faded scars, the calm stillness he carried even as the storm battered outside. "What kind of work does Ruby think you do, Mr. Wilder?" she asked, her tone steadier than she felt. He tilted his head, a flicker of a smile crossing his face. "Depends on what folks need. Sometimes I split logs. Sometimes I tell old stories. Sometimes I just sit quiet so the house doesn't feel so empty." Zarya swallowed, nodding once. "I only need quiet. For tonight." August's answer came easy, a trace of humor beneath it. "Then quiet's what I'll be. Just for tonight." Outside, thunder cracked. Rain came harder, drumming the roof like a fist. In the flash of lightning, she saw his face clearly, lines of weariness cut deep, but behind them, a glint of pride, a touch of sorrow. Zarya turned away, closing the door slowly. The house, once hollow and still, now carried the scent of rain, leather, and the presence of a stranger. A man with a price, but one whose worth could not be bought. Morning in Montana began, with a pale light spilling through dust-fogged windows. Zarya woke to the sound of steady thudding from the backyard, a rhythm deep and sure, like the heartbeat of the land. She pulled on her shawl, stepped onto the porch, and froze. August Wilder was splitting wood. His leather coat hung from a fence post, leaving only a thick work shirt rolled high on his forearms. Each swing of the axe was clean, deliberate. The muscles along his arms moved in calm precision, sweat tracing down his neck, catching the early sun. He worked in silence, not rushed, not idle, just steady. When he noticed her, he looked up and smiled faintly. "Morning, Mrs. Bennett." Zarya stood on the step, arms crossed. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No one said you did," he replied, and kept chopping. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Words felt unnecessary. The quiet rhythm of his work somehow filled the emptiness of the yard. She turned back inside, tending to the stove, pretending not to notice the sound of the axe falling steady as breath. By the time the scent of coffee drifted through the room, she heard him whistling, a tune old and worn, something that had clearly followed him across miles of open country. When she brought water out near noon, he had already mended the fence, watered the horse, and stacked a neat pile of wood. His hands were rough with sawdust, his shirt streaked with dirt, but there was an ease in his smile. "That fence'll hold against a storm," he said. "You seem used to this kind of work." "Not exactly." His voice rasped with quiet humor. "But keeping your hands busy helps you forget what's behind you." Zarya said nothing. The way he spoke, light, casual, couldn't hide the weight behind the words. By late afternoon, the light stretched long across the hill. August sat on the steps, polishing his knife, telling stories of the West. He spoke of New Mexico, where sand burned under a horse's hooves, of Kansas, where the women laughed loud and the whiskey burned hotter than the sun. He spoke of cards and bad bets, of nights sleeping under snow and waking with frost in his beard, of men who shared the road but never made it home again. Zarya didn't smile, but she listened. His voice carried the rhythm of wandering, slow, textured, and full of things left unsaid. Under the porch roof, his words wove with the dry wind, softening the lonely air between them. As the light dimmed, he pulled out a few strips of dried meat. "Mind if I use your stove?" She hesitated, then nodded. He cooked with the care of habit, hands sure and unhurried. The smell of smoked meat and coffee soon filled the house, warm, unfamiliar, yet comforting in a way she hadn't felt for years. When he set the food on the table, she looked at the simple meal: meat, beans, cornbread. Plain, but it made her chest ache. "Thank you," she murmured. "Thank you for the supper," he said, teased lightly, "or for not letting me burn the place down." She glared at him, but the corner of her mouth lifted. They ate in quiet. Only the sound of spoons, the faint sigh of wind, and the flicker of the lamp on the wall. When the meal was done, he gathered the dishes, washed them with cold water from the barrel, and wiped them dry, all without being asked. Night fell fast. Zarya lit the oil lamp and moved through the small house, feeling something unfamiliar. Not fear, presence. The house, which had known only her footsteps and the restless wind, now carried new sounds: a knife placed on a table, a chair shifted, a quiet hum from the porch. When she closed her door, he was already outside, lying under a thin blanket, back against the wall, a cigarette unlit between his fingers. His voice came low, almost a whisper to himself, then took shape as a tune. "I've ridden long roads and slept under storms, but the wind still hums where a woman once warmed." The voice was cracked, rough, but deep with warmth. A weathered ballad about men who had lost their way home. Zarya lay awake in the dark, eyes open to the ceiling. Each line seemed to seep through the thin wall, touching something hollow inside her. Outside, the wind kept blowing. Inside, her heart stumbled against its own rhythm. The old house had never felt so alive. And she knew, long before sleep came, that she would not rest that night. That morning, Montana lay unusually still. No wind, only a thin gray mist drifting low over the dry grass, like breath made visible. Zarya was in the garden, picking beans, when the faint rhythm of hooves came from the valley below. She straightened, squinting through the haze, and saw the old mail rider, a lean man in a crooked brown hat, his worn satchel hanging from one shoulder. "Letter for you, Mrs. Bennett," he rasped. Came up from the south. Zarya wiped her hands on her apron and took the envelope, pale yellow, creased from travel. In the corner was the blurred stamp of the Helena post office, and across the front, the slanted handwriting she had once known by heart. Her chest tightened. It was from Calvin Hurst, the man who once promised to marry her when that long winter ended. The man who vanished after her husband's funeral, leaving nothing behind but words that had turned to wind. She stood still, her fingertips tracing the loops of his letters, like they might reopen a healed wound. A faint breeze stirred, carrying the metallic scent of old iron and cold ash. August came walking up from the barn, straw clinging to his sleeves. When he saw the postman, he nodded in greeting, then noticed the letter clutched in her hand. He said nothing, only hung his coat and went around to the well. Zarya sat on the porch, broke the seal, and unfolded the page. The paper had yellowed. The blue ink had faded to gray. "Dearest Zarya, I am sorry for the silence. The lumber business here in Helena has been hard, but I have never forgotten my promise to you. I think of you each night and hope one day to return, to make right the time I left you lonely. Do not blame me. If God allows, I will find my way back to you before next winter comes." She read it again and again, each line a thin blade cutting through her chest. Before next winter comes. A promise too late, too thin. Zarya folded the letter, set it on her knee. Memory swept in like a sudden wind. Calvin's eyes beneath the church eaves, his voice by her husband's grave, smooth and soft like whiskey, then the long silence that turned his vows into dust. From inside the house came the sound of hammering, slow, patient blows. August was fixing the broken table leg, the dull thud of wood on wood steady as a heartbeat. She looked through the open door. He was bent over his work, sleeves rolled, the light catching his sunburned cheek. A man who was real, present, saying nothing, promising nothing, only doing. Her throat closed, tears welled, falling on the paper until the ink blurred. She pressed the letter shut, set it aside, and walked out toward the well, letting the wind dry what she could not. When she returned, the smell of coffee filled the room. August stood by the stove, pouring 2 cups. He slid one toward her without a word, his eyes not touching the letter that now lay damp on the table. "Thank you," she murmured, steadying her voice. He nodded once, nothing more. After a while, he stepped outside, leaving her with the quiet, the coffee, and the ghost of a man on paper. That afternoon, she busied herself cleaning, dusting shelves that needed none. The house stayed the same, but inside her, something tangled, a knot of past and present tightening in confusion. She could not tell whether she wanted Calvin to return or feared that he would. By dusk, the air had shifted again. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and coming rain. August sat on the steps, cup in hand, gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Zarya joined him, saying nothing. For a long time they listened to the wind moving through the grass. Then, in a quiet, even voice, he said, "Men who love you don't need paper to prove it." She turned toward him. Under the oil lamp's trembling light, his face was half shadow, half glow, his gray eyes softened by something almost tender. The words were not mockery, only truth, spoken by someone who had seen too many promises die. Neither of them spoke again. The lantern flickered, its light swaying across the wooden walls. Zarya looked at him for a long while. He met her eyes, and though neither moved, something shifted between them. Not gratitude, not yet love, but a fragile warmth born of silence shared. That night, Zarya did not open the letter again. She left it on the table beside the coffee cup, still bearing the mark of her lips. And for the first time in years, she felt she was not entirely alone. The next morning, the fog lingered late, and the sky hung heavy with a dim gray warning. Zarya woke to the sound of crackling wood. August was at the stove, turning dry logs in his steady hands. Smoke curled around his face, softening the lines of his eyes, making him seem almost carved into the quiet of the house. Part of it, necessary and wordless. She poured coffee and set a cup before him. "You can go now," she said, voice calm, almost detached. "I got a letter. He's coming back." August lifted his gaze. The pale light from the window caught the brown of his skin and the faint silver of the scar on his cheek. He didn't ask who he was. He only nodded, slow and easy. Then his mouth curved, half amused, half accepting. "Then I best finish fixing your roof before he returns." Zarya wanted to argue but couldn't. There was something in his tone, simple, unhurried, as if his staying had never been a burden to begin with. All that day, August worked outside. He climbed the roof, replaced broken boards, straightened the chimney, patched what time had cracked. Every strike of his hammer rang clean and firm. By noon, dark clouds gathered over the ridge, thunder rumbling like a warning of what was to come. Zarya watched from the porch as he worked. Sweat and sawdust clung to him. The back of his shirt grew dark with effort. She carried a bucket of water and set it by the steps. He only glanced down, nodded his thanks, and kept working. When the first raindrops fell, she called out, "Come inside. It's turning bad." "Just a few more boards," he called back, his voice steady over the rising wind. Then the sky broke open. Rain slammed against the roof and ground in wild sheets. Zarya ran into the yard, hair plastered to her face. "Get down, August," she shouted. He was still on the ladder, driving one last nail through the final plank. Lightning flared, the flash so close it painted the hill white. The thunder followed like a gunshot, and she saw him slip half a step. Her heart lurched. Without thinking, she rushed forward, reaching up. He caught her wrist, his hand rough and burning hot despite the cold rain. For a breathless moment, they stood locked like that, his balance hanging on her grasp, the storm wrapping them both. The rain was icy, but where their hands met, it burned. Their eyes met too, close, searching, unguarded. The thunder roared again, and beneath it, she could hear her heartbeat hammering, wild and frightened of itself. When he finally stepped down, both were drenched. He wrung out his shirt and gave a crooked grin. "Looks like I need a lesson in listening to women." Her voice trembled. "You just need to learn how to survive the season." August gave a low, rough laugh. "Then I'll stay till the rain lets up." She didn't answer, only opened the door, letting him in first. By evening, the storm hadn't eased. The fire blazed bright in the hearth, painting the walls gold. Heat spread through the room, blending with the damp smell of rain-soaked clothes and smoke. August stood near the fire, pulling off his shirt and hanging it over a chair. His back was solid and scarred, the map of a man who had lived too long on the road. Zarya sat at the table, pretending to mend a sleeve, but the needle faltered in her hand. Every time he moved, the light from the fire stretched his shadow tall across the wall. She lowered her gaze, though her eyes betrayed her. When he turned, he caught her looking. Their eyes met again, longer this time, steadier. He smiled, faint and wordless, then bent to toss another log into the fire. The wood popped and hissed. The wind outside beat against the shutters, yet inside only their breathing filled the space. Zarya realized something strange. She feared the storm less than the silence that would return when he left. She couldn't name what it was yet. That warmth in her chest. That ache she didn't want to end. But as the rain kept falling, she knew something was growing quietly here, between the walls that once knew only loneliness. She looked toward the fire. The light flickered across two shapes. One sitting, one standing, close but not touching. Outside, the rain fell hard. Inside, the house was no longer cold. That night, the wind shifted. Cold air swept down from the northern ridge, sliding through every crack in the old walls, until the house itself seemed to shiver. Zarya woke suddenly. The oil lamp on the table flickered weakly, its flame trembling between blue and gold. From the kitchen came a faint sound, the scrape of wood, the soft click of metal. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stepped out. August was crouched by the hearth, coaxing the fire back to life. The glow from the embers lit the planes of his face, carving him into something sharp and real. He wore only a thin undershirt, his breath visible in the cold. When he noticed her, he glanced up. "Temperature dropped fast," he said, in that low, sandpaper voice. "Didn't want you waking up cold." Zarya's fingers tightened on the blanket. "You don't have to do that." He shrugged, pulled his coat from the chair, and draped it gently over her shoulders. "That'll work better than the blanket." The brush of fabric came with a brief touch of his fingers against her neck. Light, almost nothing, but enough to make her heart skip. Heat spread through her skin, not from the fire but from him. She sat near the flames, the light catching in her dark eyes. "How long have you lived like this? Moving from one place to another, never staying?" August stared into the fire for a long while before answering. "Too long to remember." His voice was dry earth meeting rain, rough, burdened, honest. She waited. The fire popped softly. Then he drew a slow breath. "I've done things I'm not proud of. Sold my time to women who needed company." Zarya turned, startled, but he didn't look away. "Not for pleasure," he said quietly. "My sister was sick. Medicine costs more than winter. People paid me to fix fences, haul wood, sit and talk. Sometimes, more than that. I won't lie about it." Outside, the wind howled through the eaves. The fire cracked, and silence settled between them. A silence not of judgment, but of weight. Zarya didn't break her gaze. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm, soft as breath. "I'm not asking what you did to live. I just want to know, were you ever truly loved?" The question stopped him cold. His eyes flickered, and for the first time she saw something unguarded, something like fear. After a long pause, he said, "I don't think so. I've been wanted, paid for, remembered, but never loved." She kept looking at him. No pity, no scorn, just truth meeting truth. The tension in his face eased. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out, as if touching her might break the fragile stillness. She didn't pull away. When his hand met hers, the world seemed to still. The wind outside, the ticking of the lamp, the hum of the earth, all fell away until there was only warmth between their palms. Her skin burned where he touched. He leaned closer, searching her eyes for hesitation, but found only the trembling breath of someone who had waited too long to feel alive. It happened slowly. His fingers brushed a strand of hair from her face. She closed her eyes. The distance between them vanished. Their lips met, tentative at first, then deeper, steadier, as if two lost souls had finally found a home that wasn't made of walls. Outside, the storm beat wild against the boards, but inside there was only the rhythm of hearts and breath mingling with the crackle of fire. The coat slipped from her shoulders and fell soundlessly to the floor. His hands traced the line of her back, not in hunger, but in proof that she was real, that he was still here. She answered him, trembling, then stronger, afraid that if she stopped, he might dissolve into smoke. That night, there was no boundary between fear and longing. They came together not to escape loneliness, but to remember what it meant to still be alive. When the storm quieted, Zarya lay against him, her ear resting over his heartbeat. Steady, human, true. The firelight danced across his back, glowing like ripples of gold on dark water. She whispered his name, not as surrender, but as forgiveness. For him. for herself and for all the years that had come before. The first light slipped through the curtain, pale and clear as mist. It touched her hair, the wrinkled sheet, and came to rest on Zarya's face. She blinked slowly, sitting up with the cautious movement of someone waking from a dream too real. What she felt wasn't regret, just a dizzying awareness that the world hadn't changed, and yet everything had. The hearth still held a faint warmth, the scent of smoke lingering like memory. His coat hung over the chair, the last button left undone, a quiet proof of what had passed between them. From the kitchen came the soft clink of a cup, the whistle of boiling water. August was making coffee. His low, rough voice hummed a tune, something old carried faintly through the morning chill. Zarya slipped on her robe and stepped out. He stood with his back to her, shoulders broad against the pale light, moving with the same unhurried calm as always. When he turned at the sound of her footsteps, his smile was small but steady. "Morning, Mrs. Bennett," he said gently. The simple calm of his voice made her chest tighten. She couldn't trust her own, so she only nodded. "You're up early," she managed. "Long habit?" he said, pouring 2 cups. "Cold morning. Thought you might want something hot." Neither of them mentioned the night before. There were no explanations, no promises, but the silence between them had changed shape, no longer empty, but fragile, like something too new to be named. When she lifted the cup, her hand trembled slightly. He noticed, but pretended not to. Instead, he spoke of the roof. "I'll get to the east side tomorrow. That beam's getting soft." She nodded. Her voice sounded small even to herself. "Whatever you think's best." The quiet stretched. Thin, uncertain. It wasn't peace. It was the silence of something that could break with a single wrong word. By noon, the sound of hooves broke the stillness. Zarya froze. A young rider in a thick coat pulled up before the porch, dust rising around his boots. He carried an envelope. "Letter for Mrs. Bennett," he called. "From town." She stepped outside. The red wax seal gleamed against the pale paper. The sender's name burned in her chest. Calvin Hurst. The messenger added, "Said he'll be in Bitter Creek in 2 days. Wants to see you." Zarya's fingers went cold around the letter. "Thank you." He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode off down the slope, leaving her alone with the sound of her own heartbeat. August stood beneath the porch beam, one hand on the post, eyes steady on her. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. She turned away, tucking the letter into her apron. But when she faced him again, his gaze told her he already knew. After a long pause, he said quietly, "If he comes, I'll be gone." The words weren't bitter, not even sad. They were simple truth, spoken in the tone of men who'd learned how to leave before they were left. "You don't have to," she also said quickly. "I do." His faint smile was almost kind. A man shouldn't stand in a house when the woman inside still owes another her word. She wanted to speak, something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. In his eyes, she saw no jealousy, only the deep weariness of someone who'd lost too much already and didn't wish to take what wasn't his. A gust slipped through the doorway, shaking the flame of the oil lamp. The curtain fluttered, scattering gold patches of light across the floor. Zarya stood still, heart heavy, watching him. August took a step closer, stopping just within reach. He handed her his coat, still faintly warm from his body. It'll be colder tonight, he said softly. Keep it near. Her fingers brushed his as she took it. Both drew back at once. He turned to the door, setting his hat on. August. Her voice trembled. He looked over his shoulder, eyes gray as the sky before rain. Thank you, she whispered, for staying. A small, genuine smile curved his mouth. Not bright, not sad, just true. Men like me never really stay, Zarya, he said. We just stop running long enough to remember what home feels like. Then he stepped outside, quiet as he'd arrived. The door closed behind him, leaving the scent of rain, wood smoke, and a hollow space just wide enough for her heart to know. Some things can begin leaving long before they're truly gone. That afternoon, Montana changed color. Clouds pressed low against the hills, the sky dimmed, and the wind carried the smell of wet earth. From the long road leading up the hill came the sound of hooves, steady, polished, practiced. Not the rhythm of a drifter's horse, but of a man arriving with purpose. Zarya was tending the garden when she saw him. Calvin Hurst. Dark velvet coat, leather gloves, a sleek black horse brushed to a shine. He dismounted with a practiced ease, his boots gleaming, his smile perfectly measured. Only his eyes had changed, empty now, filled not with warmth, but with the quiet confidence of a man certain he'd be welcomed. Zarya, he called, voice trembling with rehearsed emotion. God, it's good to see you still here. She froze. Her lips parted, but no words came. The moment felt too full, of relief, dread, and a tired ache that didn't know what to call itself. The letter, the old dream, the ghost of a promise, all came rushing back at once. From the barn, August looked up at the sound of that name. He didn't move closer or step away. He simply stood there, tall against the fading light, watching. Calvin approached and caught Zarya's hand. You look as lovely as ever. I'm sorry for the wait. Things in Helena took longer than I thought. But I'm here now to keep my word. Zarya pulled her hand back, firm but quiet. What word would that be? He laughed softly, not hearing the steel in her tone. Why, our plan, of course. You always said we'd marry once the time was right. Well, now it is. I've got new contracts, good money coming in. We'll sell this place and move to Helena. I've friends there, business opportunities. You'll never have to live alone in this barren land again. Her gaze swept across the yard. The patched fence, the small vegetable rows, the roof mended board by board. Each piece carried August's touch, his patience, his presence. This place breathed now, in a way Calvin could never hear, but she felt in her bones. She said nothing. He mistook her silence for emotion and pressed on, his voice full of practiced kindness. We can start fresh, Zarya. You deserve better. I bought a fine house near the center of town, proper parlor, real fireplace, none of this temporary life you've had here. That word, temporary, fell like a stone in the wind. Zarya closed her eyes briefly. In her mind came flashes of August's rough hands, the sound of his hammer, the way he stoked the fire when nights grew cold. This house wasn't perfect, but it had never been temporary. Across the yard, August stood silent. He saw it all. The well-dressed man offering comfort wrapped in pride, and the woman caught between what once seemed right and what now felt true. When Calvin finished his pitch, the quiet lingered. Zarya lowered her gaze to her hands, then raised her eyes to meet his. I need time. Calvin smiled, assured. Of course. I'll stay in town a few days. When you're ready, send word. I'll come for you. He tipped his hat, turned, and mounted his horse. The sound of hooves faded into the wind, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive cologne and something colder. Absence. Zarya remained still long after he vanished. The wind moved through the willows, whispering what she couldn't say aloud. August stepped toward the porch, his gray eyes steady. He didn't ask, didn't judge. You heard? She asked softly. Just the part worth hearing, he said. What do you think? He shrugged, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth. I think a man just came back to reclaim what he once threw away. Zarya turned aside, her voice trembling. Will you be leaving again? Maybe. He looked up at the roof he'd mended, the door he'd straightened, then back to her. If he comes, I'll be gone. I already told you that. She didn't stop him. Couldn't. He went inside, packed his few things into the old leather satchel. She stood in the doorway, watching the small, familiar motions, folding his shirt, tying the strap, careful, as though afraid to break whatever fragile piece remained. When he stepped out, bag slung over his shoulder, hat in hand, she whispered, August. He paused. Yeah? Her voice nearly broke. Thank you. For staying. He nodded once. No embrace, no goodbye. Only wind and the soft cry of a horse somewhere in the mist. The door closed behind him, slow, heavy, final, like a chapter no one wanted to end. And inside the house he'd made warm again. Silence returned, filling every corner with what was left of him. The house was so quiet, she could hear the faint hiss of ashes settling in the hearth. Zarya sat at the wooden table, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, long gone cold. The late afternoon light slipped through the dusty window, landing across the bare surface where his hands had rested the night before. August had been gone more than an hour, yet every corner of the room still carried him. The hammer leaned against the wall. A trail of dry mud marked his steps across the floor. A loose button lay beneath the chair, and the smell of wood smoke lingered, strong and gentle at once like him. She reached for the worn leather coat he'd left behind. The hide was cracked, the stitching frayed. When her fingers brushed the collar, she could almost hear his rough voice again. It'll be colder tonight. You should keep warm. Her eyes closed, and tears came. Quiet, unhurried. Not from pain, but from the sharp clarity of knowing. The man who had written letters, Calvin Hurst, had never really seen her. He spoke of love as something to possess, to polish, to rescue. He wanted her displayed under warm lights in Helena, proof of his charity, not of his heart. But the man who had walked away, who had promised nothing, had simply stayed. He'd mended her roof, lit her fires, repaired the fence that no one else would touch. He'd filled the silence with the steady rhythm of work and presence, until the house had learned to breathe again. And she understood now. Sometimes the truest kind of love is the kind left unspoken, built in quiet acts that make another person's day just a little easier to bear. Zarya rose from the chair. A cold draft slipped under the door, stirring the curtain. Outside, the world was silver with fading light. Snow covered the ground in a clean white sheet. The path was nearly hidden, save for the fading prints of hooves leading away from the hill. She held his coat close, The scent of him clung to it. Smoke, sun, dry grass. Before she could think, she pulled it around her shoulders and stepped out citoyen. The wind slapped her face, sharp and stinging, but she didn't stop. Across the fence, past the half-frozen stream, she followed the trail that cut through the snow. Each step thudded in her chest, each breath a prayer she couldn't shape into words. The horizon blurred into mist. No figure in sight, only faint marks where a horse had passed. She knelt, tracing the tracks with trembling hands, her pulse hammering with a courage that only comes when a heart realizes what it can no longer lose. "August!" she called, her voice caught in the wind. No answer. She drew in a sharp breath, shouting again, louder this time. "August!" The wind swallowed her voice, tore it apart, hurled it back at her in broken echoes. Still she kept walking. The snow deepened. Her skirt snagged on the ice, her boots soaked through. She stumbled, fell to her knees, the cold biting into her palms. But she didn't cry. She looked down that endless stretch of pale road, where he might already be gone, where he might never turn back. And she kept calling. "August Wilder!" The name burst from her chest, cracked and raw, carried out into the empty valley. It echoed against the hills, scattered, then faded like a bell after service, late but honest. She stood there for a long time, breath shaking, the world around her hushed. Snow fell in thin spirals, clinging to her hair, to the coat around her shoulders. If he could hear her even once, she thought, just once, he would stop. She tilted her face to the gray sky, tears mixing with snow, leaving tiny warm streaks before vanishing. She didn't know if she was praying for him to return or only begging the wind to carry her voice to wherever he was. The last light of the sun slipped through the clouds, weak, golden, and trembling, like a promise barely kept. Zarya stood there, the valley wide and silent around her, one hand clutching his coat to her chest. And for the first time she spoke his name not as memory, but as choice. Dusk had fallen by the time Zarya reached the base of the hill. The wind smelled of coming rain, damp earth, cold stone, and the faint promise of thunder. Below, the narrow creek wound through the rocks, its water glinting weakly under a bruised sky. August was there. He knelt beside his horse, tightening the saddle strap with the slow, deliberate movements of a man accustomed to leaving. His hat was pulled low, his broad shoulders blending into the fading light, the shape of him already half swallowed by the wind. "August!" Her voice carried across the hollow, sharp, breathless. He turned. That look, calm, unsurprised, and yet shadowed by something that flickered like disbelief. "You'll catch cold, Zarya. Go back inside." "No." She stepped down the slope, her dress brushing against the wet grass. "I'm not done talking." He straightened, exhaled hard, as though the air itself weighed too much. "Zarya, don't do this. You've got someone waiting. A man who can give you a name, a home, a life that fits the world better than mine ever could." She moved closer, voice trembling. "A real home? You think that house isn't real enough? Every board you replaced, every stone you set, you made it a home." He shook his head, a tired smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "I just fixed the leaks, that's all. I'm not the man you're meant to choose." Her tone rose, sharp but breaking. "And who decides what I'm meant for? I've done what I was supposed to all my life. Married because my father said I should. Waited because people said I ought to. I'm done with ought to. I'm tired, August. The wind cut between them, tugging at his coat. Zarya, I've got nothing to give you, he said softly. No land, no name worth keeping, no money. Only these hands and a life I can't be proud of. She took another step, close enough to hear the rough cadence of his breathing. I don't need you to give me anything, she said, steady now. I just need you not to disappear. He looked down, eyes dark beneath the brim. You don't understand. I've done things, been places, things a decent woman shouldn't have to carry beside her. And I, she interrupted, her voice clear and low, don't want to live another day in silence. They stood there, the storm building around them, breath mingling in the cold. The first drop of rain fell, then another. Water slipped down her cheek, mingling with tears she hadn't noticed. Zarya held his gaze, no pleading, no fear. August, she said slowly, each word deliberate. I'm not asking you to stay. I'm telling you, I'm done waiting for anyone else. The words hung between them, quiet, but more powerful than thunder. He looked at her for a long time, long enough for the rain to darken his shoulders, long enough for her to think he would turn away. Then, slowly, he smiled, a small, rueful curve of his mouth, heavy and tender. You make a hard life for a man, Zaria Bennett. Her voice caught. Then why are you still standing here? A low, rough laugh escaped him, honest and almost boyish. He dropped the reins, stepped closer, until the breath between them vanished. God help me, he murmured. I was never good at leaving anyway. He pulled her into his arms. No promises, no explanations. Only the fierce, trembling certainty of two people holding on, because there was finally something to hold. His hands, scarred and steady, tightened around her as though to convince himself she was real. Zarya rested her forehead against his chest, feeling the wild, living beat of his heart. Rain slid over them, tapping against skin and claw-cloth. He lowered his head, kissed her. Not hurried, not hungry. A slow, deep kiss tasting of rain, of warmth, of the strange peace that comes when the running stops. The storm broke open. Water streamed over their shoulders, soaked their clothes, tangled in her hair. Still, they didn't move. For that moment, the world shrank to a single point. Her and him, the storm their witness, the silence between their heartbeats a kind of prayer. When at last the kiss broke, Zarya's lips trembled into a smile through the tears. So you're staying then? August whispered against her ear, voice husky as the wind itself. Looks like I've run out of places to go. The rain softened to a gentle fall, the land breathing beneath it. And there, beneath the gray sky of Montana, two souls who had once been lost finally stopped running and found each other instead. Years passed. The wind over Montana still carried the dry scent of wild grass, but the hill where their house stood no longer looked the same. The small, weathered cabin had grown, a broad porch now wrapped around it, wildflowers climbing the posts in gold bloom through the summer. Each evening, smoke rose from the chimney, curling into the sky, mingling with the laughter of two children chasing one another through the yard. The older with dark curls and bright brown skin, the younger with their father's gray eyes and a laugh quick as wind. August Wilder had rebuilt that house with his own hands. Every beam, every nail, every plank bore the mark of a man who once owned nothing but his labor. Now he was known across the valley as a craftsman, whose work outlasted weather and time. People hired him to build barns, porches, fences, because anything he touched, they said, held fast like a promise. Zarya, meanwhile, turned the old front room into a small school. Children from the neighboring homesteads, black, brown, mixed, the ones the town school refused, now gathered around a wooden table that August had built himself. She taught them letters and numbers, but also how to stand tall when they walked through the marketplace. Some called her foolish. Others whispered behind her back. That widow who married her hired hand, teaching those children no one wants. But still, they came. And little by little, even the whispers changed. First, it was the farmers' children. Then the children of travelers passing through, white children, too, whose parents had heard that Mrs. Bennett teaches reading better than the preacher. August never paid attention to gossip. He only smiled, planed another board, built another desk. Once, when Zarya brought lunch to his workshop, he took the tin from her hands and said with a teasing glint, "They call you the teacher, lady, and me, the teacher's carpenter." She laughed softly. "That's not wrong." He looked at her with that quiet pride she'd come to know. "No," he said, "and I'm proud of it." Those were steady years, not rich, but full. They grew vegetables, kept chickens, mended what broke. In the long afternoons, Zarya hung her laundry on the line while August sat on the porch, sawing wood, his calloused hands moving with care that never dulled. Sometimes strangers from town would pass by, pausing at the sight of the well-kept home on the hill. One day, a man stopped and asked, half curious, half smug, "Is it true your husband was once a hired man?" The question made Zarya pause. She was arranging flowers in a vase, sunlight threading through her hair. For a moment, memory swept over her. That first day on the porch, the storm, his rough voice saying, "I hear you sent for a man." She remembered the winters of silence, the years of rebuilding, every nail driven, every wound healed. Then she turned, meeting the man's gaze with calm. "Yes," she said, voice even. "He was once the man I hired." The man blinked, uncertain. "But now," she went on, her tone soft but sure, "he's the man I chose." Color rose to his face, and before he could respond, she added quietly, "And I still pay him with the rest of my life." Outside, the rhythmic sound of sawing filled the air, blending with children's laughter. August looked up from his work and caught her watching him. Their eyes met across the yard, steady, wordless, full of peace. She raised her hand in a small wave. He smiled and nodded back. That was enough. They didn't need words, didn't need proof. The house they had built stood not only on wood and stone, but on staying, forgiving, and the quiet labor of love no one else could measure. By late afternoon, sunlight turned to honey over the roof. Zarya closed her little classroom, stepped onto the porch. The children still played in the field. August sat on the steps, sweat glinting on his brow, his saw moving in a slow, even rhythm. She sat beside him and leaned her head against his shoulder. "Did you ever think we'd come this far?" she asked. He smiled, eyes fixed on the golden sky. "No," he said, "but you made me believe a man can rebuild his life, if someone's willing to sit beside him when it rains." They stayed there a long while, saying nothing. Just listening to the wind moving through the flowers, carrying the scent of wood, of earth, of a happiness built by hand and kept by heart. 30 years had passed since the wind first carried August Wilder up that lonely hill. Montana had changed. The dirt roads were paved now, and strangers came and went through the valley. But on that old stretch of land, their wooden house still stood, its porch wide, its roof solid, its trellis of wildflowers spilling gold across the steps. The children were grown. Mabel, their eldest, taught school in town. Elias, the second, worked beside his father in the carpentry shed. And the youngest, Rose, with her mother's laughter and love of words, often said, "I want to write down the stories people forget." The house was no longer just a home. Travelers passing through, tired from distance or from life, often stopped here. Some asked for a drink of water, some for a meal, others for nothing at all but a quiet place to sit and listen to the wind move through the grass. And so the story of Zaria Bennett, the woman who stopped waiting, and August Wilder, the man who found his dignity again through love, was passed on, whispered from one wanderer to the next. They said she had once been a widow on a windy hill, and he, a drifter hired to keep the house warm. They said he came with empty hands, left with a full heart, and returned to build a home, not only for her, but for anyone who lost their way and needed to remember how to begin again. They told it with that tender half-belief people reserve for legends that might have been true. Evening settled over the prairie, spilling gold over the fields. Zarya sat in her old rocking chair, knitting a blanket for the sleeping grandchild in her lap. Her hair had turned silver, her skin deepened by years under the sun, but her eyes still carried the light of a woman who had lived in truth. Beside her, August worked a piece of wood, his hands still sure despite the blur of age. When the saw whispered through the grain, he smiled. "I used to think I'd die on the road," he said. "Never thought I'd live long enough to hear wood sing in my own yard." Zarya looked up, amused. "You still won't rest, will you?" "The wood doesn't complain when I touch it," he replied, his voice rough but warm. "So I keep at it." The Montana wind rose again, carrying the scents of earth, hay, and the kitchen fire. On the table inside lay faded photographs, 2 young faces before a half-built house, 2 small children holding their mother's hand, and behind them, a sky so blue it seemed untouched by time. Zarya's gaze drifted outward, her tone soft and teasing. "Do you remember the day you asked if I was hiring you?" August looked up, his eyes still bright beneath the years. "I do." "You asked like a man already sure of the answer," she smiled. "As if you knew I'd say yes." He chuckled, the lines around his mouth deepening. "Well, I was right. You didn't pay much, but you kept me for life." Her laughter came low and rich, filling the porch like birdsong. "Your wages were high after all." He shook his head, eyes gleaming. "No. You paid me with the only thing I couldn't earn, your trust." For a long moment they said nothing, listening to the hum of the wind through the flowers. Children's laughter drifted from the yard, mingling with the faint rasp of the saw. The sun slipped lower, painting the porch in amber light. Zarya reached for his hand. It was rough and veined, the hand of a man who had built his peace the hard way. She held it gently, her voice steady. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" August's smile was quiet, content. "Not far," he said. "Just back to where we were always meant to be." The wind swelled over the prairie, carrying the scents of wood and rain and all the seasons that had shaped them. They sat together, silent and unhurried, while the sound of their laughter, older now, softer, floated out into the open air, mingling with the Montana dusk. When the sun finally slipped behind the mountains, The house on the hill glowed with warm yellow light, just as it had all those years ago. And even now, when travelers cross that valley, they say the wind carries an echo of that laughter, light, distant, and tender, like the trace of a love that once taught two weary souls how to stay. If this story made you smile, or reminded you of someone who once stood beside you through hard years, leave a comment, a like, or share it with another heart in need of hope. Because somewhere out there, someone is still waiting to hear that love, no matter how late it arrives, is always worth believing in. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more gentle tales of hearts that learned not just to wait, but to stay.